1963, the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas. The sound of a roulette wheel spinning in the distance, muffled by thick velvet curtains. In the penthouse suite, Frank Sinatra stood by the window, staring out at the neon lights that he practically owned. He was holding a glass of Jack Daniels. The ice melted, his knuckles white against the glass. The door opened, and Sammy Davis Jr. walked in. The room, usually filled with the laughter of the Rat Pack, was dead silent. These two men were more than friends. They were brothers who had conquered the world together, broken racial barriers, and rewritten the rules of show business. But tonight, there was no laughter. Tonight, there was a tension so thick it felt like smoke. Frank turned around, his blue eyes cold, piercing through the man he had once protected with his life. And what happened in that room over the next 10 minutes would leave a scar on their friendship that never fully healed. It wasn't a fist fight, but the words exchanged were more violent than any punch. But to understand why the King of Las Vegas and the world's greatest entertainer were standing on the edge of a cliff, we have to look past the tuxedos and the whiskey. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? To understand the silence in that penthouse, you have to go back to a dusty, hot afternoon in the late 1940s. Frank Sinatra was already a god, the voice that made millions of women faint. Sammy Davis Jr. was a prodigy, dancing his feet off in small clubs, struggling against a world that didn't want to look him in the eye. Frank didn't just see a black entertainer. He saw a reflection of his own soul, a perfectionist, a man driven by a hunger that food couldn't satisfy. The first time Frank really stepped in for Sammy wasn't just a favor. It was a declaration of war against the status quo. He saw a club owner tell Sammy he had to enter through the kitchen. Frank, the man who never backed down from a fight, walked up to the owner and said, in a voice that was barely a whisper but carried the weight of a sledgehammer, "If he goes through the kitchen, I go through the kitchen, and if I go through the kitchen, I don't sing." The doors opened. Sammy walked in through the front. In that moment, Sammy looked at Frank not just as a singer, but as a savior. It was the beginning of a debt that would weigh heavier than gold. For the next decade, they were unstoppable. The 1950s became their playground. When Frank formed the Rat Pack, he wasn't just building a group of friends. He was building a kingdom. Dean Martin was the brother, the cool contrast. But Sammy? Sammy was the spark. He was the one Frank marveled at. On stage at the Sands, under those hot lights, they were magic. Frank would pour a drink, Sammy would tap dance, and the audience would lose their minds. But underneath the applause, something complicated was brewing. The jokes. You know the ones. Frank would make cracks about Sammy's height, or uncomfortable racial jokes that were of the time, but stung nonetheless. Sammy would laugh. He had to laugh. He was the little brother, the mascot, the one who was just happy to be at the table. But every time he laughed, a tiny piece of his pride chipped away. He told himself it was just showbiz, that Frank loved him, and Frank did love him. But Frank loved him the way a king loves his favorite knight, ferociously, but always with the understanding of who sat on the throne. If you enjoy diving into these deep, hidden histories of the legends we love, subscribe for new stories. We are peeling back the curtain on the real lives behind the spotlight. The cracks started to deepen as the 1960s rolled in. The world was changing. The civil rights movement was catching fire. People were marching in the streets. And there was Sammy, standing on stage in a tuxedo next to Frank Sinatra, laughing at the jokes. The black community started to whisper. Was Sammy a sellout? Was he just Sinatra's shadow? Sammy heard the whispers. They kept him up at night. He wanted to be his own man, a serious artist, not just the funny guy who owed everything to Frank. But defying Frank Sinatra was dangerous. Frank demanded absolute loyalty. In Frank's world, you were either with him 100% or you were dead to him. There was no middle ground. The pressure on Sammy was immense. He was trying to navigate a racist society, a changing political landscape, and the suffocating love of the most powerful man in entertainment. Then came the moment that nearly broke them, the incident that set the stage for that night in the penthouse. It was the inauguration of John F. Kennedy. Frank had worked himself into the ground to get Kennedy elected. He had used his connections, his money, his voice. The Rat Pack was supposed to perform at the inaugural gala. It was going to be their crowning moment. But the Kennedy advisors got nervous. Sammy had recently married May Britt, a white Swedish actress. Interracial marriage was still a scandal in 1960s America. The Kennedys were afraid Sammy's presence would anger Southern voters. So the call came to Frank. Sammy can't be there. It was an impossible choice. Loyalty to his brother or loyalty to the president he had helped make. Frank Sinatra, the man who had kicked down doors for Sammy, the man who fought segregation, did the one thing Sammy never expected. He blinked. He told Sammy to stay home. Sammy took it. He told the press he had a scheduling conflict. He protected Frank. He protected the president. But inside inside, his heart was shattering. The man who had once said, "If he goes through the kitchen, I go through the kitchen," had just left him in the kitchen while he went to the ball. The dynamic shifted. Sammy wasn't just the little brother anymore. He was the liability. And Frank, consumed by his own ambition and his desperate need to be accepted by the political elite, had sacrificed his friend. The gala went on. Frank sang. The president smiled. But back in his home, Sammy Davis Jr. watched the news, and for the first time, he saw Frank not as a savior, but as a politician. The resentment started to grow, a slow-burning fire that would eventually consume the oxygen in the room. By 1963, the air was thin. Sammy was trying to assert his independence. He was taking roles Frank didn't approve of, hanging out with people Frank didn't know. He was trying to prove, mostly to himself, that he was Sammy Davis Jr., not just Frank Sinatra's friend. Frank, who was dealing with his own demons, the loss of his voice's youthful shine, the changing music scene, the feeling that the Beatles were coming to take his crown, felt Sammy pulling away, and Frank hated losing control. He saw Sammy's independence as ingratitude. "I made him," Frank would tell Dean over drinks. "I gave him the world, and now he's too busy for me." It's a tragedy common among kings. They mistake freedom for rebellion, and that brings us back to the penthouse at the Sands. Frank had called Sammy up. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. Sammy walked in, wearing a sharp suit, a cigarette in his hand, trying to look casual, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. Frank turned from the window. He didn't offer a drink. He didn't smile. "You turned down the movie," Frank said. His voice was low, devoid of the famous Sinatra warmth. Sammy nodded, swallowing hard. "It wasn't right for me, Frank. The role, it was a stereotype. I'm trying to move away from that." Frank stepped closer, the ice in his glass clinking. "It wasn't right for you? Since when do you know what's right for you better than I do? I set this up. I put my name on the line for you. I appreciate that, Frank. You know I do," Sammy said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I have to build something of my own." Frank laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Something of your own? Sammy, look out that window. Look at this town. We built this. I built this. There is no your own without me. You think those people downstairs are clapping for you? They're clapping because you're with me." The words hung in the air like poison. It was the thing Sammy feared most, that it was all true, that without Frank, he was nothing. But in that moment, something inside Sammy snapped. The years of kitchen doors, the years of jokes, the Kennedy snub, the constant need to kiss the ring. It all boiled over. He straightened his back. He looked Frank Sinatra in the eye, really looked at him, not as a subordinate, but as a man. "You're wrong, Frank," Sammy said, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he had. "They clap for me because I'm the most talented man in this hotel. I can sing better than you, I can dance better than you, and I can act circles around you. You opened the door, Frank, and I love you for it. I'll always love you for it. But I walked through it. Me, not you." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank's face went pale, then red. Nobody spoke to the chairman like that. Not the mob bosses, not the studio heads, and certainly not the kid he had plucked from obscurity. Frank looked at his glass, then he looked at the wall, struggling with a rage that wanted to destroy everything in its path. He wanted to throw Sammy out. He wanted to ruin him. He could do it. One phone call, and Sammy's bookings would dry up. One word, and the casinos would close their doors. The power Frank held was terrifying. But as he looked at Sammy, standing there, shaking but defiant, Frank saw something else. He saw the kid who had been told he was less than human because of the color of his skin. He saw the fighter. He saw himself. "Get out," Frank whispered. Sammy didn't move for a second. He wanted a hug. He wanted a fight. He wanted anything but this cold dismissal. "Frank, I said get out," Frank roared, throwing his glass against the wall. It shattered, shards of glass and amber liquid raining down on the expensive carpet. Sammy turned and walked out. The door clicked shut, and just like that, the music stopped. The Rat Pack didn't officially end that night, but the soul of it died in that room. If you want to keep exploring the emotional roller coasters of these legends, make sure you subscribe for new stories. We bring the history to life. The years that followed were a strange purgatory. They still worked together occasionally. They did Robin and the Seven Hoods. They smiled for the cameras. But the warmth was gone. Frank went his way, diving deeper into a darker, more secluded life. He married Mia Farrow, then divorced. He fought with the press. He retired, then came back. He was searching for relevance in a world that was moving on to rock and roll. Sammy drifted too. He embraced the Candyman era, became a pop culture icon, hugged Richard Nixon, a move that alienated him from the black community even more than the Rat Pack ever did. Sammy was lost, trying to find a home in a world that still didn't quite know what to do with him. He missed Frank. God, he missed him. He missed the protection, the certainty, the feeling that as long as he was standing next to Francis Albert Sinatra, nothing bad could happen. Frank missed him too, though he would never admit it. He missed the energy. He missed the one guy who could actually keep up with him on stage. Frank surrounded himself with new people, sycophants who laughed too hard at his jokes and never challenged him. It was lonely at the top. The silence in Frank's life grew louder. He realized that power doesn't keep you warm at night. Respect doesn't make you laugh. He had won the argument, but he had lost his brother. It wasn't until the late 1980s that the real reconciliation happened. The Together Again tour. Dean, Frank, and Sammy. The world held its breath. It was supposed to be the victory lap, the Kings returning to reclaim their throne. But time is the one opponent Frank Sinatra couldn't beat. Dean was tired, grieving the loss of his son, and barely wanted to be there. Frank was forgetting lyrics, frustrated, fighting against his own aging body. And Sammy was the glue. Sammy was the one with the energy, dancing, singing, trying to keep the magic alive for all of them. But Sammy was dying. Throat cancer was eating him alive from the inside. But he didn't tell them at first. He didn't want the tour to stop. He didn't want the dream to end. There's a story from that tour that breaks your heart. One night, backstage, Sammy was in pain, severe pain. He was hunched over in his dressing room. Frank walked in. Frank, who had been so hard, so controlling, saw his friend, his little brother, fading away. Frank didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't give orders. He walked over, sat down next to Sammy, and put a hand on his shoulder. "You okay, Smokey?" Frank asked, using the old nickname. But this time it wasn't a joke. It was a term of endearment. Sammy looked up, sweat on his brow. "I'm tired, Francis. I'm just so tired." Frank nodded, tears welling in those famous blue eyes. "I know, but we're almost home. Just a few more songs. I don't know if I can do it," Sammy whispered. Frank squeezed his shoulder. "You can, because you're Sammy Davis Jr., and because I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." For that moment, the years of resentment, the Kennedy snub, the arguments, the glass thrown against the wall, it all dissolved. They were just two old men, two survivors of a brutal industry, holding on to each other in the dark. Frank realized then that Sammy hadn't just been a sidekick. Sammy had been the heart, and Frank, for all his power, was about to lose the only person who truly understood the journey they had been on. Sammy died in 1990. When the news broke, Frank was devastated. He didn't speak to the press. He retreated into his compound in Palm Springs. The lights in Las Vegas were dimmed in Sammy's honor, but the dimming of the light in Frank's soul was far darker. He had outlived them all. He was the last man standing, but the victory felt hollow. He reportedly said to a friend, "It was a hell of a ride, wasn't it? But God, it's quiet now." Frank Sinatra, the man who commanded stadiums, who made presidents wait, was finally forced to confront the silence he had spent his life running from. The tragedy of Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. isn't that they fought, it's that they loved each other in a world that didn't know how to let them be equals. Frank wanted to be the savior because he needed to be needed. Sammy wanted to be the equal because he needed to be respected. They gave each other everything, and they took everything from each other. Frank gave Sammy a career. Sammy gave Frank a soul. But pride, that deadly, beautiful Sinatra pride, kept them from ever fully putting down their armor until it was almost too late. If you are moved by the stories of these complicated, brilliant humans, please subscribe for new stories. We are here to tell the tales that history books often forget. In the end, who was right? Was Frank a controlling tyrant who used Sammy to make himself look benevolent? Or was he a loyal friend who was hurt when his protege tried to fly too far from the nest? Was Sammy an ungrateful egoist? Or was he a man fighting for his dignity in a racist world? The answer is both. They were mirrors of each other, both talented, both insecure, both desperate for love. Frank Sinatra needed Sammy Davis Jr. to feel complete, and Sammy needed Frank to feel safe. When the music stopped and the applause faded, all that was left were two men trying to figure out if the sacrifices they made for fame were worth the price of their friendship. Tonight, somewhere in the ether, maybe the music is playing again. Maybe they are back at the sands in the golden hour. Frank pours a drink, Sammy taps his foot, and this time, when the joke is told, they both laugh, really laugh, because the hierarchy is gone. There is no chairman, there is no mascot, just two friends singing against the darkness. But down here, in the real world, we are left with the records, the movies, and the lingering question. What happens when the person who saves you is also the person who casts the biggest shadow? Before you go, don't forget to subscribe for new stories so you never miss a chapter of these legendary lives. And I want to ask you, do you think Sammy owed Frank his loyalty forever, or was he right to walk away? Let me know in the comments below. See you in the next story. Subscribe for new stories.